Hello, my name is Lance Lattig. I work as a human rights investigator with the U.S. federal courts here in California. And one thing we've noticed here in the judicial system in California and indeed nationwide is a number of suspected MS-13 gang members are being indicted on a number of charges. It's certainly at a rate arguably is larger than has happened before. The context of this is important to bear in mind too, because a lot of the news today is about the number of Central Americans coming to the border. There's the xenophobia and stigmatization of those migrants from the administration, and part of that stigmatization is equating particularly unaccompanied minors, young women, women with children, fleeing violence in Central America, with being violent gang members. The second part of the context that's important to remember when we think about what MS-13 is, it's a gang that's made in the United States. It's a domestically produced. What happened in an earlier crisis in Central America during the wars of the late 1970s, 1980s, people were fleeing violence. Particular case from El Salvador, coming to the U.S., they were not given asylum. Nicaraguans were, because for political reasons, and Nicaraguans, ironically, are noticeably absent from these gangs today. They were given asylum and integrated into citizenship. The situation for Central Americans coming here was quite different. They had to cross illegally at the time. They didn't have papers. They notably came to cities like Los Angeles, where they faced threats from gangs that were already in Los Angeles. So they banded together. MS-13 actually started as a group of young men who liked heavy metal. And it was a heavy metal fan club that morphed into a gang in response to threats in Los Angeles. Many of these young men were basically picked up by police for a variety of charges. Some were convicted. They went to the California prison system, which is really a school for crime in many ways. And so they faced the brutalizing effects of the prison system. After they finished their terms, they were deported back to El Salvador. So we have a transnational gang operating. The gangs operate with impunity, or near impunity, in El Salvador, which is why a lot of Salvadorans are fleeing the country now, because they face death threats. Particularly young women are faced with threats of sexual violence or sexual assault by gang members. And we know a number of cases like this where families with, say, young or teenage daughters come to the United States in order to protect their daughters from gang members. So in a sense, this migration is what's being stigmatized by the U.S. government. Here in the U.S., there have been a number of long series of smaller scale crimes like drug dealing, dealing marijuana, for example, but also some homicides as well, notably in Long Island, which really dominated the pages of the New York Post, which is its readership area. And the New York Post, of course, is the #1 newspaper source of news in the White House today. So there is a connection and a link there in terms of a long pattern from Trump's point of view of stigmatizing members of other racial ethnic groups. I mean, this went back to the Central Park Five, which he wanted executed. Later, they were falsely convicted of vicious rape in Central Park and released after years in jail. So we've seen this the political use of certain isolated incidents before. In California, what we've seen is really a big push from DOJ in Washington. It's interesting to see that the capital crimes unit there has been advocating capital punishment, also, or very, very harsh sentences for suspected MS-13 members here. Besides the larger implications of what that's doing to the California justice system, it also is a misreading of what an MS-13 member is. It's not necessarily a club where people become card-carrying members and they're indoctrinated into. At some levels, it becomes that through practice, in a sense. Members stay in the gang for a long time, they acquire various tattoos, they end up in prison and so forth, but that's not necessarily the standard route for people today. And what the administration's policy on migration is doing now is making unaccompanied minors, putting them even more at risk. They were already at risk under the previous administration, but even more at risk and in need of protection. And when these unaccompanied minors or young people come, usually traveling alone with coyotes coming across the border, they end up in American cities or in the countryside in need of protection, because as back in the 1980s, they face threats as well, not just from other rival gangs, but also from really intensified deportation efforts by ICE.